So the project was originally intended to be an educational resource for students studying our human trafficking course. But when the stories came in, we realised that we had to make it available to a much wider audience. And human trafficking is an abhorrent crime, and its story must be told, and its victims need to be heard, and its perpetrators should be brought to justice. And hopefully this expose in some small way will help to achieve this.
When you think of human trafficking, what countries come to mind?
For me, it's mostly the Middle Eastern countries and the African countries, basically.
Yeah. Greece, mostly, all around the Mediterranean.
I guess I think of Vietnam, maybe some African countries as well.
It's mostly in the poor countries like India, Sri Lanka, Nepal. The people are really poor.
I'd say more probably like Africa, maybe even like sort of Eastern Europe.
For me, I'd say Africa.
Middle Eastern, Asian kind of countries, I think.
I think of sort of Europe areas.
Certainly not Australia, mainly countries like, I don't know, I guess like what's called the developing world, but also like the USA and stuff, yeah, but not Australia.
I think Eastern Europe, for some reason, probably Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I'd go pretty much.
I'd say Taiwan. Although like not very developed countries.
But I say it's right here.
Human trafficking. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that affects up to 40 million people every year. And it's happening right here in Australia. I've spent the past 4 months travelling throughout Australia speaking with experts, survivors, law enforcement, border protection personnel, charities and human rights organisations to learn more about Australia's involvement in this profitable and inhumane trade. I'm Breann Fallon and this is Trafficked to Australia. My first stop was the ACT, where I'd organised to meet with 3 experts in the field. Dr Amber McKinley, a clinical and forensic victimologist and a senior lecturer at Sturt University's Graduate School of Policing and Security. Australian Police Medal and Order of Australia Medal recipient Commander Daniel Widdowson from the Australian Federal Police. And Superintendent Stephen Rutzow, who oversees national field operations at Australian Border Force. Amber, can you tell me what is human trafficking?
Human trafficking is the movement of people from one nation to another, country to another, but under coercion or manipulation. So they believe that they are going for one purpose, but are more often than not moved and taken away from all family. Their papers are removed from them and almost always from a criminal entity or a group of people that are going to overwhelm the individual and force them to do something that they don't want to do.
So if human trafficking involves people being moved, what's the difference between that and people smuggling?
So an example, if I lived in Myanmar and I wanted to move into Thailand but couldn't get there via legal means, I can pay a people smuggler to help me get across the border safely and let me blend into society in Thailand. The difference is I'm empowered, I've paid that money, and although it's an illegal thing, I've still got the power to do what I do when I get to Thailand, whereas the human trafficking, I'm disempowered, made very, very vulnerable and often criminally offended against.
Are there different types of human trafficking?
Absolutely. There's everything from sexual exploitation of men, women and children, which is often forgotten. I think men and boys are left out of the equation often. There are debt bondage, forced marriage, forced organ transplantation, a large range of them for commercial exploitation.
Debt bonding, forced marriage, domestic servitude and sexual servitude would be the main ones.
Slavery, bondage, forced marriage, forced labour, so there's a lot of different aspects to it.
What does it look like in Australia? Do we have all those types of human trafficking?
Unfortunately, we do. We have all of them. It's evolved over the years. It's evolved from a policing perspective and a social perspective as well, and probably from an awareness perspective. So I suspect that we've had the majority of them for a long time, but as we've got better at understanding what human trafficking is and we've got better at reporting it, we see the different types. So, you know, everything from forced marriage, which is currently quite high on the AFP radar because it's become better known and understood, and there seems to be, you know, a fair bit of it within the country. But, you know, things like trafficking for sex trafficking has always been probably the most traditional one we've had, and forced labour and domestic labour have been sort of the ones that have come to the forefront in the last sort of 6-7 years.
Within the National Action Plan is 5 strategic priorities in order to combat human trafficking. To support them, there is 46 action items or elements that will help meet those 5 priorities.
It was encouraging to hear that Australia has a national action plan to combat modern slavery and human trafficking. I wanted to learn more about this, so I contacted Frances Finney, Assistant Secretary to the Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking Branch at Australian Border Force.
So Australia has a National Action Plan, which is our strategic response, and it brings together all efforts, both government, non-government, business and academia, and a range of areas into a framework where we have 5 priority areas. Those priorities are around prevention, also around disruption and investigation and prosecution. Another area is around providing support for victims and survivors. The other priority area is in partnering with a range of different sectors, civil society, academia, unions, businesses, and so on to address these crimes. And then also research is very important.
What does preventing modern-day slavery and human trafficking look like in an Australian context?
Well, it's about raising awareness, and first and foremost, people may not realise that this is happening in Australia. People may not know what it looks like.
This led me to Professor Jennifer Breann, Anti-Slavery Australia CEO.
We started back in the early 2000s, and it was at that time that the United Nations were first starting to tackle this issue of human trafficking. And at the UN, they were making a convention, a protocol, that defined human trafficking for the first time. And we wondered at the Community Law Centre here at UTS whether trafficking was a problem here in Australia, you know, whether this was something that we should focus on. Well, after asking the question, the answer was absolutely yes. And very soon after asking the question, we started to meet women who had been trafficked to Australia. So the whole Anti-Slavery Australia project really started back in the early 2000s. There are key areas that must be addressed. One of those is awareness raising, and it is so apparent that within the Australian community there is a very low awareness of any form of slavery or trafficking. We surveyed the Sydney community and found that 66% of people were unaware that modern slavery happened in Australia. So that particular program was designed to raise awareness.
I had read about child trafficking and I guess sexual kind of behaviours, yeah.
Work in like the wool industry, maybe producing metals, mining.
Yeah, forced labour. Yeah.
Drugs? Yeah, could be drugs.
Sex or some kind of slavery.
Children, sex trafficking, especially with young girls.
I have no idea. I'd like to think like labour or something like that for physical work.
I assume it's mostly like sex slavery.
Maybe even fruit picking and stuff like that.
Probably people involved in the drugs industry, maybe, I guess, probably younger people who are maybe trapped in circumstances they can't help. maybe effectively locked in like attics and things, just doing like drug trade and things. That's what I picture.
I think for some reason what comes to mind is probably sex industry, sex workers being trafficked, especially into places like Sydney. Apart from that, also probably younger children that are being trafficked across borders.
Yeah, people being brought in with kind of false expectation and then being held.
Yeah.
It could be like kind of like a labour thing. It could be some sort of like familial thing, like marriage or some sort of like child arrangement, or even just, I don't know, like child labour, things like that.
Oh, sexual trafficking, prostitution. Yeah, totally.
Are any of them more prevalent in Australia than others?
Definitely slavery and sexual exploitation. They're the two major ones.
So with the focus on labour, what are the industries that are particularly involved?
Construction, agriculture, forestry, fisheries also. And think about the very large country we are in remote regions. Those that are coming through human trafficking are often moved out onto very, very large properties. And that remoteness adds to their papers being removed and them becoming entangled in this and not being able to get assistance.
Forced labour is probably the most well-known is on farms, whether it's fruit picking, vegetable, whatever it is, that you've got a large proportion of people out working under conditions, and if the conditions aren't correct, it can actually tip into forced labour, depending on what those conditions are. And that's normally when people owe debt and they can't get out of it, they don't feel free to leave, they don't have the ability to leave. A whole range of factors come into that. In general public restaurants, there's actually quite a large proportion of reports that come in from people being, forced to work in restaurants in less than ideal conditions, or in conditions that become an issue for human trafficking. In arranged marriages, or in cultural areas where you might have arranged marriages, there's a separate piece in forced marriage, which is quite different to an arranged marriage. So we have cultural issues that you might come across with children and with adults in forced marriage. So that's an area. You might come across it in the domestic environment with maids, or when you have hired help. That's quite often an area where they can be exploited.
What you can see is people coming to Australia believing they're on a legitimate visa and that everything's taken care of, and they just have to come. It's a great work opportunity. Come to Australia, we'll look after you, we'll put you up for accommodation, we'll look after your visa price, travel, airfare, and when they come to Australia, they get told, oh, no, actually that's not the case, you owe us $20,000.
The Salvation Army's Trafficking and Slavery Safe House provides accommodation and holistic case management support to victim survivors. I sat down with Program Manager Claudia Cummins to gain a better understanding of what this support looks like.
Since 2008, Salvation Army in Australia has operated the first women's refuge for survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. We also provide outreach case management support, so a range of direct services to survivors as they recover from their experiences and start to rebuild their lives. And we're also involved in trying to strengthen communities to prevent modern slavery from happening in the first place.
So what does the women's refuge look like? How does that work?
Yeah, so the Safe House, it just looks like a normal house on the street. It's just out in the suburbs, and obviously the address is kept strictly confidential, and that is our highest level of security that we have, and everybody who works there and everybody who lives there really upholds that and takes that very seriously. It's a large house. We have space for up to 10 women to stay there in their own rooms. They share kitchens, bathrooms, living rooms. We've got an outdoor garden with a very thriving veggie patch as well. So we also have our casework office on site there. So the casework team, which is myself and 2 case managers, we're all working there as well on site, but just kind of separated, a little bit separate from the house. And everybody who lives there knows that they can come and talk to us about anything they're concerned about at any time, and we're on call to them as well.
I imagine that mental health is just one of the things that a woman might face once they're liberated from such exploitation. What difficulties do the women face when they are liberated?
Well, obviously the mental health impact is huge. Often people as well have been in situations for sometimes a period of years. There's huge impacts on physical health, on all areas of their life. In terms of the safe house supports, we do a lot of work on independent living skills as well when people are ready to start learning how to take public transport again, or maybe for the first time in Australia, learning to budget and manage their own finances, and of course working on English language skills and employment and education goals. I think an important thing to note as well is that when somebody has just come out of that situation of slavery, it is really important that they have the time and the space to be and to feel safe. And that also involves them having access to legal advice and knowing that they have rights and that they have choices in the next steps that they take. And it also involves them really starting to understand starting to unpack all of the lies that they have been told as part of their trafficking experience. Survivors have often been told, if you seek help, you will be deported. If you seek help, no one will believe you and you will be put in jail. If you seek help, harm will come to you or your family. Perhaps as well, if you seek help, shame will be put on your family or on you for what has happened to you. So it's really important that there is the time and space for a survivor to unpack all of those things and to learn that that isn't the case and that they have rights and that they are believed and that they trust that the system in Australia will support them, and that can help them then take the next step and decide if they are willing to engage in a criminal investigation, for example, as well.
Sisters of Charity Foundation have partnered with the Salvation Army in a program that equips and empowers survivors of human trafficking to transition safely back into Australian society. I met with their CEO, Louise Burton, in Bondi, New South Wales.
The first client we had in our program was a gentleman called Karim, and he had come to Australia from his country, being offered a job for a diplomatic family, and he was led to believe that he was going to be their driver and he was going to actually receive quite a good income, that he would be able to send that income back to his fiancée, and in time, he would go home and marry her and start a new life. And what transpired was he wasn't even ever driving. He was actually really, first of all, he was housed in a storeroom in this home. Then he was doing mainly domestic work. He wasn't allowed to leave the home without the diplomat's wife, so maybe they went shopping, but she had to be with him. He was meant to be only there for a year, and he wasn't getting, the small amount of pay was being sent home, but he wasn't actually receiving any funds here. And so what actually happened, he'd been here for about 18 months and obviously had no access to his own passport, so he couldn't really escape. But he actually sustained a workplace injury and ended up going to hospital. And in the hospital, he met a fellow countryman who spoke his language, and he explained to him that this was not the right, this is not the right way Australians treat their staff. It's wrong. And that's where the Salvation Army became involved. And then we've supported him. In time, he was able to get a job, make enough money to bring his fiancée out here. He got married, had a child, and he was in supported housing, our transitional housing. And all of this time, he's been able to be an Uber driver, a cleaner. He wanted to be in a slightly a different area, closer to friends. So he actually had enough, negotiation skills and still receiving support from the Salvation Army to rent a new apartment that was slightly bigger and more accessible to his friends.
If you were looking for it perhaps in a business, what might the warning signs be?
But I think it'd be really hard to tell, if someone was being trafficked. What signs do you watch out for? I wouldn't really be sure what signs to look out for.
What are some indicators of human trafficking?
There's a lot of different indicators, and the most simple ones are things like that they don't have their passport, they don't know where their address is, or they can't say to you where their address is. If you talk to them, they may not understand. If you ask them if they've been down to the shops, they may not actually understand where the shops are. They don't have their own transport. They're always picked up by somebody or dropped off by somebody. But there's some main ones like that. They're on a tourist visa and they might be working. They're never left alone. They've always got someone that's overseeing or intervene if you want to talk to them. But there's a lot of subtle ones as well, and that's really around when you start to chat to them and they might be fearful, or they all start looking at someone else before they answer. And they're really quite subtle indicators, but they're really important. And importantly, the crime of human exploitation's evolved. Criminals evolve. So, a lot of them know that if they take their passports, that's an easy indicator. So they don't take their passports. What they'll do is they psychologically threaten them now. So they'll threaten them with injury or harm to their families offshore, back at home. They might threaten them with taking money away from them, or they'll keep their money so that they haven't got access to it.
It's things like a young person having, for example, tattoos that are unusual or unexplainable. Although, of course, culturally now in Australia, tattoos are the thing, and a lot of people have them. They may be that you notice 3 women have the same tattoo in the same place. So it's used as a brand or a marking to identify them to others. It might be that a person that is significantly younger is wearing clothes that you may consider to be incredibly inappropriate.
Her Space is a Melbourne-based not-for-profit organisation that specialises in the well-being and mental recovery for women who have experienced exploitation here in Australia. Their executive officer and former lawyer Roxanne Fabiano met with me to talk through the recovery process for survivors.
There's a myriad of challenges. Looking at it holistically, it's helpful to understand that exploitation results in multiple different traumas that have many complex impacts in the life of a survivor that are very devastating. It can range from psychological, emotional, other physical impacts through to social, cultural, legal, economic impacts as well. A survivor can face PTSD, depression, anxiety, more specifically insomnia, nightmares, eating disorders, intense feelings of hopelessness and shame, physical injuries and illnesses that can be long-term. They face the realities of scarring from tattooing and branding from the people that have exploited them. They can be ostracised and shamed by their friends, family and communities. They can require long-term recovery support. And if they're not given support, then women can find themselves back in experiences of exploitation.
I'm wondering how you got involved with Her Space, because I understand you had a bit of a career change.
Yes, that's right. I was a lawyer for many years. I practiced primarily in dispute resolution or litigation. But I always had this desire or this pull to invest my life in helping other people to heal from hurts, to express their talents and to flourish. There's actually a story I like to share with people about when I was walking through a rose garden. And there were so many varieties of roses, they were really beautiful. And I was examining each one, the patterns and the unique colours and the unique fragrances of each rose. And they were really glorious. And I thought at the time of the people that are exploited or subject to modern slavery in Australia, how they are these unique, beautiful individuals with complexity of character, of talents and of dreams, far more valuable and breathtaking than any flower. And I thought about how another person can take that glory and trample it underfoot, abuse and forsake it. And I thought, how can we allow that to happen in this nation? That paradigm of violence and exploitation, it reduces a human being to a object or a purpose which strips them of their humanity. And I would say that it denies that kaleidoscope of blessing that these people are to the world.
Is there one case that you think you'll always carry with you that you could share?
Yes. The details are not all public, so it's about sexual exploitation, and it's about a person that was missing for a very, very long time. They were found to be forced in a brothel, and it was in the most extreme natures, so chained, bound, and the people that had access to her in terms of the people that were using her, both her bosses, but also the Johns that were having sex with her, did not consider her human, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. She survived, and I will use that term, but she was definitely a victim of some of the most heinous crimes I've ever seen, and is one of the most broken human beings I've ever seen, but has been luckily able to return back to her country, although not to her family. She couldn't face them, so, but she's free, and she has people like me who will hold her close forever. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Sorry, I just need a minute.
Yeah.
That was intense. No, it's okay. Yeah. Sorry.
In the heart of Sydney, on a street I'd walked down many times before, I'd never noticed there was an exotic dancers lounge. I went there to meet with sex work advocate Louisa Caruso, who shared some insights on life in the industry with me.
So in a strip club, for example, like being able to, dance, but the weeks that you aren't really feeling up for dancing, whatever the circumstance may be, being able to be a waitress, so just serve the drinks, not have to worry about that, and still make just as good tips. See, the waitresses get an hourly, and they also get tips on top of that, and they get tipped quite well.
Yeah.
Like, some nights they'd make more money than me.
Yeah, and that seems so illogical to me that within one establishment, you could have this complete different level of standard of what one person is getting as opposed to the other.
Yeah.
And the fact that that seems completely almost deregulated, I'm not really, au fait with the laws, but the fact that you could have that completely different treatment of two people standing on the same floor, that doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad you're doing your advocacy work, because everybody needs to know about this inequality, and everybody needs to know about why there are these places where trafficking might occur because of those inequalities that are employment inequalities.
I'm a dancer, and I've been a sex work advocate for about 5 years. I use my business as a platform to generate money to help survivors and sex workers that are perhaps in vulnerable situations.
Tell me more about what that looks like.
Sex work advocacy, particularly in New South Wales, I get to work with a lot of great organisations such as the Scarlet Alliance and SWAP, which is the Sex Work Outreach Project. They're both community-based programs. Scarlet Alliance and SWAP work towards better health and safety within the working environments, such as brothels, strip clubs, anything that sort of comes under the umbrella. It's quite common for sex workers who work in brothels or on the street to cross paths with people who have been trafficked to Australia, even within Australia. Most survivors have been forced into slavery from a really young age, never given the opportunity to even learn the basics of language and communication. The survivors that do make it out of these situations are often given jobs at brothels that are in very terrible working conditions. Yeah.
What causes human trafficking, do you think?
Greed.
So who's responsible?
Anyone that's going to make a profit from them.
Greed, money. It is. I think it's even more than drugs.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
Billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
So who causes it?
Who causes it? Greedy people who want money.
I don't know. Is it the powers that be are involved in it, or I don't know. It's quite an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, I suppose.
People are, obviously they will go for the money. So
we don't know where, or most people don't know where their clothes come from. We look for bargains in shops. We look at buying or even opening businesses that are set to be very, very cheap. So we want the bargains, and we want to be able to change with fashions, for example. So our clothes become something you use for a season and get rid of. We are not doing what they did in the 30s and 40s, which was, sew and mend and reuse. Thankfully, there's been a large uptake in the concept of recycling and upcycling things, so maybe we'll see it slow. But certainly, in my experience, it seems to be that our demand for wanting more and more and more for cheaper and cheaper is driving this as a commercial industry.
Not only is Australia a demand country, we also supply humans. Christine Carolyn is the Executive Officer of ACRAF, Australian Catholic Religious Against Trafficking of Humans. We met in Melbourne CBD, where Christine shared this confronting example of exit trafficking from Australia.
Yeah, federal police actually asked us, maybe 10, 12 years ago, if we could possibly support somebody who was just so shattered by their trafficking experience. And one of the sisters said, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll work with a lot of Catholic sisters." She said, "Sure." And she met with that woman every week, just for coffee, like a good neighbour sort of relationship. And so since then, we've started a companionship program, and we offer to the Red Cross and to some of the other NGOs in our networks an opportunity to offer companionship to people who've been trafficked. And one of them was a teenager whose mum's offered her a lovely trip home to her home country at the end of her year 11. She went to a high school here in Melbourne, just an ordinary kid. She went home and found that a relative had arranged a marriage for her, and he was going to force her to marry a guy in his 60s. And he took from her her mobile phone and her passport and her return ticket, and just said, "You're not going to need those anymore." So she, very fortunately, we'd run a training program in her school for the teachers. So when she was able to contact using social media some kids, they asked the teachers, and the teachers went, "Oh, we know what to do with this." So the Federal Police got her home and onto the Red Cross Support for Trafficked People program.
The Support for Trafficked People program is run by the Red Cross. Senior Program Officer Lena Garcia Daza taught me about the kinds of support this program offers.
The Support for Trafficked People program is a government-funded program, and the main objective is to support and assist people that have been in a situation of exploitation and that have been trafficked and that are in Australia. So it really focuses on helping identifying their needs, their goals and aspirations, and really meeting those needs, and helping them through their journey, through their recovery journey, up to the point that they are able to take informed decisions and really be able to identify what do they want, how do they want it, and able to really do it by themselves.
So what sort of things would the Red Cross provide as part of that program?
So, as I was saying before, the response is a very client-centered response, which means that we work based on the needs of the client. So we identify the needs, and depending on their needs, we provide the support. But usually the support is very much focused on economic and financial support. We provide education and training when it's needed, employment opportunities, support to find sustainable and safe accommodation, support in counseling services. We provide support in referring them to legal and migration advice, really depending on the needs that are identifying throughout the process.
So how would a client get in touch with the Red Cross?
The referrals to the Support for Trafficked People program are made exclusively by the Australian Federal Police. So it's the Australian Federal Police that identified indicators of trafficking, and when they identify these indicators of trafficking, they refer people to the support program. So that's how we receive them and start providing support. However, having said that, of course, Red Cross is a big organization and people know Red Cross from different things. So we also get people that contact directly Red Cross asking for help, asking for confidential advice.
There was a job in the Philippines last year where a mother was selling her children online between 1 year of age and 7. So the person who wanted the footage and or the act would pay and never meet them. It was just done via film. She was arrested in country by her own police force with the federal police in tow.
Are Australians purchasing that sort of online material?
Yes, unfortunately.
Digital trafficking, an industry where victims are often trafficked within their own country and forced to engage in sexual activity for international customers. Melinda Tankard-Reist is co-founder of the grassroots campaigning movement Collective Shout for a world free of sexual exploitation.
The online sexual exploitation of children, for example, live distant child abuse, which has become an epidemic. It's described as the fastest growing crime in the world. It is basically men purchasing children to be sexually tortured and raped. Every viewing of an image fuels a global trade in the bodies of children to meet that demand. We know that Australian men are in the top 3 consumers of child sexual exploitation material. I mean, they are ordering up the live torture and rape and degradation of children, sometimes even the murder of children. And this is not, there used to be this idea, fortunately we're not hearing it quite as much, but when I first started writing on these issues over a decade ago, we'd hear this idea that it's just watching, it's just looking, but every download fuels the trade because the viewer, the one viewing and watching, has become complicit. They've become a patron of the global sex industry, which needs the bodies of children to meet this global demand.
So who is the perpetrator here?
Who is the perpetrator? That's a great question, because there's a lot of stereotypes about the perpetrators and what they might look like, and they can be anyone at all, anyone. Teachers, sports coaches, dads with kids. The research that exists suggests that consuming certainly child sexual exploitation material and also purchasing child sexual abuse dolls can lead to real-time offending, and that's what the Australian Institute of Criminology says. Because there's this false argument, this false idea that better a doll than a real child, but actually there's a trajectory, and normalising fantasies for children can lead to real-time offending.
International Justice Mission is a global organisation working toward ending exploitation by disrupting the slave trade. Steve Baird, IJM CEO, shared one of their success stories.
Now, there was one case which is actually relevant to Australians, which is quite recent, where a 61-year-old Victorian man was arrested for this crime and sourcing sexual abuse material from children in the Philippines. And through the arrest of this man, we're actually able to find another perpetrator in Australia who was also arrested, and then it led to the arrest of 7 Filipino perpetrators. Importantly, what that all led to was the rescue of 27 children and 2 adults who were being abused and held for these crimes. And one of the children rescued was a 2-month-old boy. So this is just horrific, but it's good that they're out now. There is a beautiful young woman we work with called Ruby, who was the victim of online sexual exploitation, and she was actually held in that environment for 2 years. Where it's very inspiring for me is she has gone on to become a survivor voice and advocate that no other child would go through what she went through.
Look a Little Deeper was a bit of a brainstorm between myself and Senior Sergeant Marilyn Ross of the Victoria Police. So back in 2010, the Victorian Government commissioned an inquiry into the trafficking of women into the sex industry, and one of the recommendations was for Victoria Police to stand up a sex industry coordination unit, and Marilyn Ross was the Senior Sergeant in charge at that time and took that on as the initiative, and I was in charge of the Human Trafficking team. And so we formed a really great collaborative relationship where we really wanted to learn about the sex industry in Victoria. And we have registered brothels in Victoria, and so we would go out with the Victorian Police every Thursday and do rounds of the brothels to understand who was in them, the women, what their challenges were and all those sorts of things, and really get to understand the industry.
Senior Sergeant Marilyn Ross from the Victoria Police worked alongside Commander Woodward in creating the Look a Little Deeper campaign. I reached out to Victoria Police and was invited to meet with her.
So with Look a Little Deeper, we wanted to make it as simple as possible. What that is we based it around 4 questions. What is human trafficking and slavery? Where might I see human trafficking and slavery in my day-to-day duties? What are the indicators? And most importantly, what do I do if I suspect that this crime type is happening?
And is Look a Little Deeper just for police still?
No, and at the time, Danielle and I, once we started to interview some subject matter experts and start to create some products and to get out to our members, we went, gee, we could put this across any sort of organisation or agency, particularly with those 4 questions, because anyone can ask themselves, those questions. And it's now going out to other state and territory police and Commonwealth agencies with a first response capacity, but they're also seeing and realising that actually it can go wider again.
Is it just government agencies' job to stop human trafficking?
Stopping human trafficking is everyone's responsibility. So I'm talking about not only government, or NGOs, the non-government organisations, it's the community, it's everybody. Yep, stopping human trafficking and slavery is everyone's responsibility.
Is there a particular case that you're allowed to share with me that sticks out to you from your time working on human trafficking?
Probably one that my team had, and it was a case where we found a woman hidden in a wall cavity at a licensed brothel. And for me, if that's not an indicator of human trafficking, I don't know what is. So that would be something for me that I always say to when I present that, particularly to our police officers, is believe the unbelievable in this space, because I know when we first got that phone call, and we worked on that job with Border Force, who were fantastic, and initially I've gone, well, who would build a room to hide sex workers in a licensed brothel when it's a licensed brothel? You're allowed to have sex workers there. So for that to actually be true, and for us to go down there and actually take a woman out of a wall cavity, you go, well, these things can happen, they do happen, and we need to make sure we know everything we can about human trafficking. And as I said before, that's all of us. Get on the website, have a look, become familiar with the indicators and things like that, and just make sure you're looking and observing. And if you do see something, look a little deeper and contact the AFP.
It's actually braver to admit something bad's happening, and that's actually hard to do. It takes courage to admit that bad things are happening, when I think most people, good setting here, would rather be at this beach enjoying themselves than talking about a dark topic like human trafficking.
If you thought somebody was a victim of trafficking, how would you help them?
I guess it's just like anyone who's having issues, you just want to have the time to have a conversation with them and listen. And then from that, try and use my skill set to support them the best as I can.
I would definitely go to the police, but I'd also probably try and contact people I know that work with that kind of thing.
Gee, I wouldn't walk here, I'd walk out and find another boss, but of course
people who are entrapped don't have that privilege.
I'm really proud to have been part of a team of DT Global and Yes She Matters that recently did a paper on transnational crime, and we looked at 38% of suspected traffickers globally were female, which was quite significant because most people associate human trafficking with, criminal gangs and men. 32% of the people that have been prosecuted have been female. So again, a fairly high number. I think from a cultural point of view, particularly in somewhere like Southeast Asia, women are always the ones that do the buying and selling in markets. So it's totally a personal opinion, but I think that's where it's coming from, where in the Southeast Asian market of human trafficking.
Global Arms Incorporated is an Australian registered not-for-profit organisation dedicated to the elimination of trafficking, sexual exploitation and abuse of men, women and children. They're based in Mae Sot near the Thailand-Myanmar border. I contacted their CEO Michelle Moore to gain a better understanding of how this Australian organisation is making a difference.
Global Arms is an anti-trafficking organisation and we work in Southeast Asia. We have two sides of it. We have a prevention side and then almost like a frontline side. So we run a training centre in Mae Sot where we teach everything from reality-based self-defense, so hand-to-hand combat, to learning how to sew or how to do administration or computers. Or we have something called Life Skills, which is like a program to help young teens sort of move into adulthood. So when they turn 18 and they almost like graduate, or they have to move out of the children's home that they're in, but they have some skills then they can take on and use in the community. On the other side, we have a program called Yes She Matters, where we work with women and girls. We've had some male cases as well, who have gone through gender-based violence. So they've either been trafficked into sexual exploitation or modern slavery, they're caught in domestic violence, they've been raped, sexually assaulted or abused in some way. They can call our 24/7 hotline, and we have an emergency response team that will then go out and meet them where they're at. So whether it's at their house or on site where the incidents happened, or we meet them at the police station or the hospital, and then we walk with them through that process.
I heard there's a specific case of a woman that you're supporting who is living in a little bit more of an off-the-grid location near Mae Sot. Is that right?
Yeah, there is. So she's an older lady. She's a mum of 4 or 5 boys. I can't remember the exact number.
Is she able to get support from you on an ongoing basis?
Yes, so we make sure that we go up there and we visit her regularly.
Today I'd arranged for one of our clients to come and share her story with you. Her name is Nan U, she's 43 years old and she's a trafficking victim. She is a mother of 4 boys and lived in Burma, and she followed one of her boys over into Thailand to try and convince him to come home. When she got here, after a period of time, he ended up ditching her and going to the big city. So she was trying to find work to save enough money to move back to Burma or to go home to her husband and other 3 sons. She came across a guy who said he would help her, and he ended up trafficking her up into the mountains. She didn't know where she was, she didn't read or write, and he managed to keep her for 12 years as his sex slave, and she was also forced to work in the fields for 7 days a week. And then he claimed her as his wife. He used to beat her quite often, and he also used drugs or yaba a lot. So one night he had beaten her so badly she had run down to the checkpoint to where the soldiers were, and they had contacted us and asked for help. They took her to the hospital, and she was being treated for her wounds when we met her. We gave her safe housing and helped process her case, and then after a period of time we helped relocate her. But unfortunately he found her, and she's been re-trafficked. She's disappeared. We don't know if she's dead or alive, or we don't know where she is. We just don't know.
Whilst the majority of people who are tackling human trafficking in Australia are working within government agencies or in not-for-profit organisations, some are raising awareness in their own unique and creative way, like Belinda Ramirez, author of Wildflowers, a book that shares raw, inspiring and hope-filled stories of survivors in the Philippines.
Went to the Philippines first in 2003 and again in 2006, and there's just some countries that you go to and you leave a little piece of your heart behind. And for me, that was the Philippines. You know, I'd met the people there, I'd helped out with some local church, some high school ministries, and I just fell in love with the country. At that point, it really struck something in me. It was true. It's like, if we know all of this stuff is happening, why aren't we doing something about it? Like, it's going on this very moment. I started donating to an organisation, you know, once a month, but then I felt a bit of a stirring of like, well, what else can I do? What about to use my giftings as well? And I think it's a great baseline for anyone to get aware and, you know, start supporting an organisation who's making a difference. But if you've also got, you know, skills or gifts that you want to use for the cause, then explore what that might look like. We lined up interviews with a few different organisations over a couple of trips to the Philippines. So we flew in 2016, we went there twice, and we did some photo shoots, took a little dictaphone that a friend, you know, let me permanently borrow, I've still got it in my study drawer somewhere, to record the interviews that got printed and published in 2020.
None of the girls Belinda spoke with were trafficked into Australia, but many were trafficked between provinces for the purposes of online exploitation, which catered to Australian customers. And others were first-hand victims of Australian pedophile Peter Scully. Sally Irwin was exposed to the reality of human trafficking when she was based in Berlin. Upon returning home, she became aware that human trafficking was happening in her own city. Wanting to raise awareness and funds, Sally founded the Freedom Hub.
The Freedom Hub began in 2014 after I'd returned from a stint in Europe, where I was living there for 4 years with my husband posted to a job over there in the Australian Embassy. While he was doing his big career move, I was volunteering in what was like a needle exchange, helping girls who had been fallen victim of sex slavery in Berlin in Germany. They had been tricked or lured from Eastern Europe, from the various places like Belgium and Hungary and all those places. And they'd been tricked and lured into jobs that they thought were real, usually by women. These women would be like recruitment agencies for hairdressers, for bars, for restaurants. And when they got there, they'd be placed into a basement of a brothel and shot up with heroin and beaten and all the rest until they'd lost all will and all self. And then they were allowed up on the street, and therefore by then they were so high on heroin they'd be able to come in and do needle exchange and get coffee from us, and the traffickers would always be watching us but knew that they would be coming back for their next hit soon, so they had a bit more freedom than the girls that were trapped in the brothels. So when I returned to Australia and found out it was happening here, I thought, well, now I can do something about it. I can actually speak the language, I can lobby Parliament, I can recruit people to get involved, I can get volunteer movement happening. So that's really why the Freedom Hub started. I wrote the mission back in 2014 and it hasn't changed, and that was to end slavery in our country, and we do that through raising awareness, cafes, weddings and events, as well as having volunteer teams all over Australia raising awareness. The second part was to help victims of that crime in our country recover. So we have a survivor school where we help survivors, and then the third part of the mission was to partner in the fight to end global slavery, because slavery is not an isolated thing, especially with supply chains around the world and people being trafficked across different jurisdictions and different countries. Partnership is essential for us to end this as a crime.
Nazira Zupdarova, a Tajikistan-born woman now living in Sydney, is a survivor of child forced labour, something she only realised a few years ago whilst volunteering at the Freedom Hub.
When did you realise that you had been a child slave?
Well, this is an interesting story because I was volunteering with Freedom Hub, and one day I just came from university to help out in the office. And the manager who was there, she was reading a report or an article, something like this, and she was pretty angry and just oh, I can't believe this, just saying like angry phrases, like frustrated. I was like, are you okay there? Like, can I help you with anything? She's like, no, I'm just so frustrated with Uzbekistan. I was like, well, this is random. Why Uzbekistan? She's like, well, apparently per capita, I think it was 2015, 2016 when we had this conversation, Uzbekistan uses the most child slave. I was the second most. I was like, this is horrible. What are they doing to these poor children that they're like using child slaves? And she's like, cotton picking. I laughed. I was like, sure, cotton picking. I was like, how? I was like, what do you mean cotton picking? I was like, well, they just summon children from schools and put on the fields to pick cotton. I was like, yeah, everybody does that. I was like, I'm half Uzbek. I've been in Uzbekistan for a couple of years, so everyone does it. We did it. She's like, oh. You did it? I was like, yeah, you Westerners exaggerating everything. I was like, it's not a big deal. She's like, okay, cool. Can I ask you a few questions about that experience? I was like, sure. And she's like, how old were you? I was like, oh, I was little, maybe like 6-7 years old. And she's like, okay, did anyone pay? I was like, God, no, they never pay. From what I know. She's like, sure. And as I answer, I realize my answers and I'm like, and she's like, well, I'm gonna leave it with you to ponder on your answers. I was like, oh.
What should I do, anyone do, if they suspect human trafficking is taking place?
I think hand it to the authorities. They are the people that have the power here in Australia to do something. Have the conversation. If you're concerned about being involved or something, it can be a walk into a police station and just say you're concerned and what you've noticed, I suppose. I think there's no place for vigilantism, so it's just definitely better to hand it over.
What we're really looking for from Australians to say, this is an important issue. Any good which is on our shelf simply cannot have slavery in its supply chain.
Now, my message is to any person, to a person experiencing harm or a person worried about someone else, if you think that there is an issue, reach out.
There's the devastating reality of the darker side to human nature. And then there is that hopeful reality of the beautiful qualities that I see in the women that I work with.
It can be anywhere, right? In the city, it can be in the quietest suburb. It's all around us. And if it doesn't sit right with you, it's probably because it's not right.
I think we've got to get out of this idea that it's far away, it's someone else's problem, it's way over there. You know, attitudes lead to behaviours, and we've allowed the shaping of attitudes which convey to certain men that children are not off limits. They are, little girls exist for you.
I'd like Australians to know that it is out there. It's a terrible crime. You know, these people are subjected to conditions that we would not even, you know, I guess, you know, wish on our worst enemy. And I think that, you know, that level of cruelty with human exploitation and something that they may never actually ever get out of, and it's just for money. And that's what I think is really tragic, is that, you know, it's greed.
If in your day-to-day life you choose to look a little deeper and suspect that someone is a victim of human trafficking, you can contact the Australian Federal Police on 131 AFP.